the word, it is in fact, our proposed plan. I may slip and use the word selected. It is a slip if I do indicate that. This is a plan which we are proposing at this time, and we're offering it to the public for your comment. And again, tomorrow is the beginning of a 30-day comment period on this proposal. There are two, I guess, critical parts to what we're proposing. Number one is we're proposing limiting the area that we're going to be, area of groundwater we're going to be treating to the area on and near the site where the highest levels of contamination have been found. And the other unique feature of the proposal is that we are proposing to do it over as an interim measure. That is, we are proposing implementing this groundwater extraction and treatment and discharge system for a 5-year period in order to see how much progress we can make. And I guess this first slide, I'm going to ask Doug to put up for me, demonstrates, at least to some extent, why that is. So, this slide is not, I should not say this slide is terribly exact for the selected remedy. It's basically up here for demonstration purposes, but you can see that for two chemicals, one of which is 1,4-dichlorobenzene, that is the cross-hatched line, and also for another contaminant, trichloroethylene, a solvent was used at the site. Both of these contaminants were used at the site. They have slightly different chemical properties, and they're found throughout the area we found to be contaminated. As you can see, theoretically, with time, the level of trichloroethylene drops very radically under the modeling that we've done. In fact, it seems to drop very close to the 0 line in a 10 to 15-year period. I guess you could try to draw it off that map. One must keep in mind for that contaminant, the federal drinking water standard is 5 parts per billion. So as you can see, 5 would be almost imperceptibly close to the 0 line on this map, on this figure. For dichlorobenzene, the other line, which seems to drop off less quickly but approaches 0 as well out here by the 200-year point. I want to stress that this is not necessarily indicative of the proposed plan, the plan we are proposing to do. You can see both of these involve very long time periods. This is one of the reasons why we want to go with an interim plan. We want to see if this theory is in fact what we will see when we turn the system on. Another reason we are going with the feature that limits the extraction with the area closest to the site is if in fact we cannot get cleanup in time frames much under this, we do not want to have to disrupt the entire town of Ashland, tearing streets up and installing extraction wells in a lot of locations, if in fact we cannot get rapid cleanups, or not rapid cleanups, but cleanups within a reasonable time frame, whatever that is. A second component to the reason we're going interim is the cap that's now being constructed. There are organic contaminants emanating from the hill area, and the cap which is now being constructed will control those to a point. The costs of this remedy, which are estimated at about $7.4 million for 5 years, including roughly $5 million capital costs, $2 million in operation and maintenance costs for 5 years, include construction of a collection system at the down gradient edge of the cap, which you saw on some of the old slides. Before we know exactly what it is, what effect that cap is going to have for sure on the levels that are coming out of the cap, we don't feel that we should go ahead and install a collection trench that could cost, I believe the cost was estimated around $1 million, was it roughly? In excess of $1 million. So again, we want to make sure that we're spending the money wisely. So to lay out some of the components of the proposed plan, could you change that for me? The first group of activities we'll be working on pre-design activities, and those will include mainly field activities, one of which involves evaluating treatment processes on a pilot scale. We're going to look at three different treatment alternatives. One is air stripping, one is a biological process, and the third is an ultraviolet ozonation treatment system. I should point out that not all ultraviolet oxidation systems use ozone, but that's on the slide. In any case, we felt basically after screening through the different technologies that could be used to treat the contamination in the groundwater that we should look at these three that survived the screening process on a real-life scale to see which one worked the best. We will be actually pilot testing two of them. We will select two of them based on a cost-effectiveness analysis that we have yet to do. The second part of the pre-design activities will be aquifer testing in the extraction area. We'll be setting up extraction tests, that is maybe installing additional wells, pumping those wells, and seeing how the groundwater table around the area drops and how much water is yielded. This is an important part of the process of designing the system. How big an area will be affecting is definitely an important part of the process. Additionally, we're going to be installing some more deep bedrock wells near the site to even more fully delineate the contamination. One of the open questions on this site at this point is if we have a large pool of very, very highly concentrated liquids at greater depths than even we've looked at right now. So we're going to be doing some more testing to see what areas, if any, have deep bedrock contamination. That is important in that if that is the case, they could serve as a reservoir for cleanup and hinder our cleanup efforts. The fourth part of the cleanup activities, the pre-design activities, involves evaluating the need for the feasibility of the groundwater collection system downgrading of the cap, and that's what I talked about before. So we'll be taking a preliminary look at that. So once we've selected the system that we'll be using from amongst those three systems I just mentioned, we'll be setting up a groundwater pump and treat system, which is extracting groundwater around the industrial park. I want to stress that although we have a physically delineated extraction zone on the maps centered on the railroad tracks, the industrial park, exactly where that will be down to the last foot, we do not know at this time, but there are obviously questions about possible settling problems with buildings and railroads, and we're going to have to look at those problems as well. But it's generally going to be in the area of the industrial park, again, to lower the amount of disruption that could be caused to the community. We'll be treating the groundwater with the groundwater treatment system that survives our pre-design process, and we'll be discharging the effluent at levels which are safe for drinking and for aquatic life to the Sudbury River. The costs in the feasibility study also include the cost of installing a separate outfall to the Sudbury River. It is possible that we could employ the existing storm drain that leaves the site right now. And that system would operate for a 5-year period, at which time, I guess we can go to the next slide, we would reassess the process. And I guess this next map just shows the extraction area that Alan showed you. Again, this area in here is preliminary, I want to stress. At this point, we feel that by employing this system, we will draw water from this gray shaded area in here. Without the trench on the hill, we would draw water from this area, but at a much slower rate. Again, the question is on the absolute effectiveness of that cap. Again, I believe the plan calls for installation of approximately 5 wells in that area. A treatment system would be set up probably around the industrial park, and the outfall could either be a force main to the river, or it could be chemical brook, depending on how our preliminary design studies go, which discharges to the river right there. Okay, other components. Oh, I got a misspelled word on this slide. Institutional controls. Institutional controls will definitely include public awareness programs like like what we're doing this evening. And it'll definitely include access controls such as fencing. And it also may include deed and land use restrictions. And I want to stress tonight, although we're calling for this in this proposal, the EPA has no authority to impose those. Those can only, as I understand it, as far as deed restrictions, be imposed by the landowners themselves, which is something we could probably discuss later on if someone's interested. It will also include inspection of the Magunka Rural Water Line. Now, the feasibility study concludes, and I want to make this clear, that there is no scientifically highly probable chance that water could be, contaminated groundwater could be drawn into the Ashland water supply. There's been some concern by the community that during fire flows, when fire personnel were drawing water out of the pipes at high rates, that we could have an inverse pressure in the pipe and draw contaminated groundwater into the system. Theoretically, it is possible. Under normal conditions, of course, the water in the pipe is at higher pressure than the water outside. Any leaks in the pipe, which I understand is rather old, would cause water to flow from inside the pipe to outside. Theoretically, it is possible. We don't feel it's likely. However, due to community concern, we feel we're going to take the step of doing a limited inspection of the pipe out there to determine if any contamination from the site has caused any deterioration from the pipe. Unfortunately, I always have to stress this, that the statute we operate under forbids us from spending federal dollars on repairing water lines that were not caused by contamination from the sites. So that's definitely an important thing that we have to learn here if in fact there is any deterioration. And the last part of the component of the plan is for continuing monitoring our wells that we've got installed throughout the study area you saw on the maps before. And we're also going to be doing some monitoring of selected residential wells. Again, we don't feel any of them are in danger of being contaminated right now, but again, due to community concerns, we feel it's prudent to monitor some of them in order to make sure that isn't the case. And again, just to reiterate, after 5 years, there'll be a reassessment. The progress of meeting target levels and cleanup goals will be assessed, and a final decision will be made. The treatment system will continue to operate until a final record of decision has been signed for this operable unit. That is, it will continue to operate, assuming there's a protracted study, as is sometimes the case in this program. The treatment system will continue to operate during that period. And last but not least, I guess just again to clarify what the treatment system would consist of. Again, this is all schematic. Extraction wells would draw the contaminants out of the ground into a precipitation unit, which would serve to remove metals. Sand filter would obviously remove the precipitated metals, and then it would enter what is shown on this slide, an air stripping tower. Now, this is one of the 3 technologies that we will be looking at during our pre-design studies. It is also possible that part of the treatment train will be a biological system or what is called an ultraviolet oxidation system, which uses an ultraviolet light and sometimes ozone and sometimes hydrogen peroxide to destroy the contaminants. After it leaves that part of the treatment facility, It will go through carbon filters to remove anything else that these other units have not removed, and the discharge of the clean water, which will meet standards that are safe to drink and also safe for aquatic life. So in some cases, aquatic life criteria are lower even than human drinking standards. If that seems a lot, it is the case. They'll be safe for both receptors. But that's basically the plan. I guess I will turn it back to Rich to moderate questions. And actually, not going by the agenda again. You caught me, Rich. We'll go over to Doug Guttrow. We'll talk about the public's participation in this whole process.
Thank you. You've heard a lot of information here tonight, much of it technical, and I'm sure you'll have ample time to get answers to your questions. I'm sure you need some clarifications on some of the issues that were brought up. Before I talk about the public comment period, I'd just like to acknowledge some of the individuals who are in the audience, and including Representative David Magnani, Board of Selectmen Barry Bresnick, members of the Board of Health, and also from the local Emergency Planning Commission, we have some members as well. First and foremost, I'd like, if any of you haven't picked up the information at the front table on the way in, we have a press release which announces the public meeting tonight, as well as the initiation of the comment period and the public hearing that's going to be held here on the 18th in this room. It's beginning at 7 p.m. on July 18th. Also is a copy of the proposed cleanup plan, which was the topic of tonight's discussion. On pages 13 through 17 of that plan, for better clarification, if all of your questions aren't answered tonight, you might want to refer to that. That specifically goes through the preferred alternative that EPA has proposed tonight. Also have up at the front desk some general information on the Superfund program that talks about Nyanza Chemical and a number of other Superfund sites in Massachusetts. So I encourage you to pick those up. Again, those of you who have not signed up for our mailing list, there's a sign-in sheet. I encourage you to sign up there, and you will continue to receive information as we make it available through direct mail. Starting tomorrow, the 27th of June, begins a 30-day public comment period. That will run through July 26th. Written comments can be submitted to EPA to David Lederer. His number is his address and telephone number on page 4 of this proposed plan. I encourage you, if you're going to put your comments in writing, to use that address and submit them by care of business on July 26th to Dave Lederer. Also, as I mentioned, there's a public hearing on July 18th. I want to talk a little bit about the format of that hearing. It's quite different from tonight's public meeting. Tonight's public meeting is to give a presentation of the feasibility study, remedial investigation, risk assessment, with the focus on EPA's preferred cleanup alternative. During a public comment period, EPA also has what's called a public hearing. The only presentation that will be given that evening is a brief recap by David Lederer of EPA's preferred alternative. There will be a court reporter here who will transcribe the entire hearing. The primary objective of the hearing is so that once you have a chance to digest, read, and understand EPA's preferred alternative and the other alternatives outlined in the feasibility study, you'll have an opportunity to submit oral comments for the record that we need to address later on in the process, and I will get to that. Also, for your information, we have established an information repository in the Ashland Public Library. Any and all information generated for the Nyanza Chemical site is in the Ashland Public Library, as well as EPA Records Center at 90 Canal Street in Boston. Behind me here is a copy of the administrative record, which is all of the materials EPA uses in making a final cleanup decision. This will be placed in the Ashland Public Library either tomorrow or sometime in the very near future, and I encourage you to take a peek at it if you have any further technical questions or need some references that are more detailed than what's outlined here in the proposed plan. Following the close of the public comment period, which is going, as I said, to run through July 26th, EPA will consider all of the comments, public comments, and comments from the state of Massachusetts in making a final cleanup decision. We will issue what is called a responsiveness summary. That means that we are obligated to respond to each and every one of those comments in a document that will accompany the final or interim cleanup decision or record of decision, which we expect to be signed by our regional administrator sometime this fall. I am now going to turn it back to Rich Cavagnero so we can have a question and answer session.
Thank you, Doug. I'd like to remind you that for the citizens of Ashland and anyone else watching cable TV, we would ask that you would use one of the two mics for your questions. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
Barry Bresnick, Selectman. First off, on behalf of the town, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and giving the town the full presentation, in-depth presentation, history and alternatives and recommendations that you have tonight. I appreciate this part of the process and your efforts in it. I think it's the nature of this type of meeting that people who have questions tonight are probably not going to dwell on the more positive aspects or the aspects which they agree with, but are more likely going to dwell on questions they might have and areas which they may not be in full agreement. So let me address some of those that I have. Using your own risk assessment criteria which you used, it's obviously important to the EPA, as it is to the town, to take the plume area and to clean the groundwater up to the extent that we begin, probably over a long period of time, to start approaching somewhere near drinking water standards. As David pointed out, in some cases it could be as short as 20 years, and in other cases with different chemicals it could conceivably be as long as 200 years, but at least the process starts. What concerns me a little bit is if it's important enough to take approximately half of the area of the plume and do this type of process to basically the area west of Tilton Ave, why is it less important to take the other half of the plume and to not address it and to basically leave it as it is? And I realize that this is a preliminary approach, and that after the first five years, it's possible that you may well decide to stay longer, we hope, and you may well decide to increase the scope of the cleanup. I would have liked to have seen your alternative 4 used, which was somewhat marginally more expensive, but did address the entire plume. And I wish you would comment on that and why we might not be able to look forward to alternative 4 and address the entire plume for this 5 years. Thank you.
Dave, I think I'll let you answer.
Primarily, the reasons for going with, I won't go through all the criteria, but we'll go through the largest of them. The largest reasons to go with alternative 2 versus the more extensive ones involves, from a community aspect, the disruption it would cause to the town, but that's for the town to judge, and I guess we'll be looking for comments from the town on that and from the citizens on that question. But on a more scientific scale, at this point, you could see from that chart that I put up, that graph I put up, we'll be attacking the area which is the most contaminated by far, and trying to see how quickly we can lower contaminant levels in that very near field area as quickly as we can. Obviously, the problems that we're going to have installing this vast network, a potentially vast network throughout a large part of the town, is going to delay the process to an extent to getting the system online. But aside from that, we're looking to go after the area that is most contaminated and to see how much progress we can make in the real world before we make a decision, a more long-term decision on what to do about the entire plume. That's basically the rationale.
To add something to that, I think EPA nationally is, well, I know EPA nationally is taking a hard look at basically the pump and treat method, which is what we call this, that being installing wells to pump out contaminated groundwater, treat it, and then either re-inject it or discharge it somewhere. Our headquarters people did a study of, I believe, 19 of these systems that had been put into effect in the country, and also examined a lot of what I would call anecdotal evidence of other efforts of this type, and essentially have come to somewhat of a conclusion, if you will, that there's a lot that EPA and the rest of the scientific community don't know about pump and treat, particularly in terms of how long it's going to take to clean up any particular aquifer. I think what we have found from these studies are that we can remove a large volume or mass of contaminants. Pump and treat does get contaminants out of the ground. However, the question is, again, how long is it going to be until we can actually say that the residual levels in the aquifer are going to meet our drinking water standards? And that is a very big unknown. Consequently, nationwide, our policies recently been changing in the groundwater area to call for interim remedies, whereby we would try to, again, attack the mass of a contamination at its highest levels, and to, again, actually run a treatment system for some period of time. You know, whether or not it's 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years is something that can be argued about. We feel that, I believe that 5 years would be a reasonable period of time to get enough data to determine how effective this is going to be, and essentially to come back at the end of that period, do another feasibility study essentially, and relook at our models that we used and decide if that 200-year time frame we predicted is in the ballpark, or if it's really more likely 100 years or 1,000 or 20 years. So this is proposed solution, I guess, is not something that's going to be unique to Nyanza, and it's based on the realization of EPA nationally that we do have to basically try this method for extended periods of time, and then determine, you know, whether or not we ought to go with this, go with a larger extraction system, or investigate another method. In terms of the risk here, as Sarah described, hopefully she'll tell me if I'm wrong here, I think what we heard her say was that on the current conditions, we basically do not see unacceptable risk here because people are not using this groundwater for drinking water purposes. We've also looked at the current risk from off-gassing, as she called it, the chemicals from the groundwater plume infiltrating people's basements, primarily in springtime, and we also did not find that to be unacceptable. We have in the past, I believe, done some actual sampling in addition to the modeling in people's basements, I believe in a school in the area and in some of the homes directly north of the Conrail tracks. And again, the information we have currently is that, thankfully, given the non-use of the groundwater in the area, we don't have an unacceptable risk posed by this. So I guess we feel that by going after the most contaminated area in the industrial park, this will allow us, we have some time to see how effective this is going to be, and I guess we feel confident that that no one is at a current risk from the groundwater, and this will allow us to do this. But again, as Dave said, you know, this is why we're out here tonight, and we hope you would think about this over the next 4 weeks and either at our public hearing or during the comment period, let us know what you think. I heard your preliminary opinions tonight, Barry, and we'd ask you to think about it further.
I guess I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
My name's Joe Duanel. I'm from the Middlesex News. How tall will the tower be in that design, the airstripping tower? And my second part of the question is, if you leave after 5 years, what happens to the treatment plant? Is it taken apart, or can the town use it, or can someone else come in and pick up where you left off?
Okay, I'll let Alan, I guess, answer the airstripper question. But first, I'll try the other one. Again, what we're proposing here is to pick a remedy and to build it and operate it for an approximate 5-year period of time. There's another part of this program we haven't talked about at all tonight, but essentially that's the enforcement aspect of things. We are required under the statute, the law, to try to get the cleanup performed by the responsible parties as defined by the law, or at least to have them pay the government back for these costs. So, as you're probably well aware, the first record of decision we signed for this site back in 1985, I believe, we did not secure a settlement with responsible parties to implement that remedy, and the government, through the Corps of Engineers, has been constructing that. We have done quite a bit of legwork, I guess you would call it, in the intervening period. We had a meeting, I believe, in this past April, Dave, with a number of responsible parties, potentially responsible parties. I have to stress the word potential here. And those parties, I believe, have formed a committee, and we fully expect that after we sign this record of decision, we will be negotiating with those parties, and hopefully we'll get a settlement for them to implement this. As to what happens at the end of the 5-year period, again, it somewhat depends on who builds this. If the government builds it, the government will own it, whereas if the responsible parties build it, they will own it. Essentially what will happen at the end of the 5 years is, again, we will do another feasibility study, I believe, and sign another record of decision to make a final, hopefully a final decision on what to do with groundwater at the site. And essentially that would basically indicate if we were going to continue to operate that treatment plant, replace it with another one, modify the extraction system, or decide to do nothing. And I assume under whichever option we decided, we'd also come to a decision on what to do with the actual treatment works out there. I defer the other part of your question to Alan, I believe, on the airstripper, height of an airstripping tower. Or Dave.
Generally, the airstripping towers would be approximately 30 to 40 feet high, and we just happen to have some slides of some of these treatment processes. It's so hot that we thought we would get by without showing them, but if there's interest, we'll show them really, really quickly. This is a ultraviolet oxidation treatment, pilot treatment facility. This has a, actually this is full scale. This has a capacity of about 50 gallons a minute. It was operating up at the Wells G&H site up in Woburn about a month ago, and we went up and took some photos of it. And you can actually see the ultraviolet light coming out of the apparatus at the bottom. You can't see any of the parts, but again, it involves exposing the water to an oxidant, like hydrogen peroxide in this case, and an ultraviolet light. And the purpose is to break down the contaminants to carbon dioxide in water. This is an airstripper which is operating at a site, I believe, up in Maine. I want to stress that this unit here is approximately 3 times to 4 times larger than in flow capacity than the one we were talking about building here. You can see the stack coming out of the roof. As far as the building goes, it's not terribly different than things we see out the site right now. And inside, There's Jim Sebastian from our Public Affairs Office, smiling in between the two columns, which I believe are carbon columns, which are filtering the air prior to its discharge to the environment. Again, these are carbon filters for air discharge. And there's the actual stripper itself. The air tower, as you can see, goes through the roof. But basically what it involves is a flow, a countercurrent flow. Water is pumped in at the top, and air is forced in from the bottom. The water goes down, it's collected at the bottom, the air is forced up, and it transfers the contaminants from the liquid phase, from the dissolved phase into the gas phase. Once it's in the gas phase, we remove it from the gas, from the air, and we discharge the air to the environment basically in a clean state. But that's basically what one looks like.
Just to follow up on that question, the people who are potentially responsible going to build this, you're trying to get them to build the entire second phase?
Well,
If I understood you correctly?
what our intention is you can.
Yes, that's our intention. Again,
My question, I guess, since you said that, what happens if there's like a legal battle, or if they don't have the money, or? I didn't know that's something new.
well, actually, it's not really new. We've been doing this since 1980. Again, on the first phase of Nyanza, I believe we came to the decision that negotiations were not going to be productive, at least based on what we knew of who might be responsible at that point in time. And we also, I believe, felt the problem couldn't wait and decided to use federal money to build the first phase. I guess what I'm saying to you tonight is we have had a preliminary meeting with potentially responsible parties who expressed some interest, at least in meeting with us, and we would intend to go through a process that we call special notice after we sign a record of decision. Essentially what that involves is sending them something called a special notice letter, which essentially gives them approximately 60 days to come into the government, EPA and the state DEP. I'd like to also mention, I forgot to mention that Jane DeParstek from the DEP is with us tonight. We would ask those parties to give us what we call a good faith offer. Essentially, a good faith offer is just about what it sounds like. It's a good faith offer to either finance the remedy or some part of it, or to build it. And if we thought that offer was made in good faith and it was a good offer, we would continue negotiations for probably another 60 to 120 days. Hopefully at the end of that process we would sign a consent agreement or consent decree with those parties. Essentially what that would be a legally binding document under which they would design and construct and operate this remedy. Should we get to, if those negotiations are to fail, then essentially we have the only really other choice we have is to go to the federal Superfund and to ask for those monies to build this with federal funds, which is what we intend to do. I can't speculate at this time as to how soon that would occur, whether those funds are available. The Superfund law was extended just this past year for another 3 years, so we would fully anticipate that there would be funding available in the event that the responsible parties were not willing to implement this phase of the remedy. But again, that is somewhat speculation on my part.
So 21 people are going to get a bill for $7.4 million. 21 parties.
I'm not sure if it's 21 now, Dave. 22, I guess. They're not getting a bill, okay? What they're getting is an offer to negotiate, right? We've already spent a large sum of money on the site, probably in the vicinity of $15 million. So again, when we would go to the table with these parties, we would be looking to recover the past costs we've already spent and to get them to implement this second phase of the remedy, or to finance it. You're welcome.
I'll try to be brief. No, there's just a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. This working all right? Oh, okay. I just wanted to find out what the process, as you said, you're using one now up in Maine, is it? What is the reason they're using it for? Is it similar to the case in Ashland? And also, this process of the ultraviolet, and what was the other method of disposing of the contaminants? It goes up to through a scrubber, would it be, or a smoke eliminator, or some sort of a means of disintegrating? I don't understand fully. You know, maybe I should take another few weeks and read what all of us are trying to absorb tonight. There's a lot of reading for us all to do, and the people watching on cable, they should be down at these meetings, not sitting comfortably at home. But I'm saying that there's a lot. This is your town. It's not my town. I get a lot of criticism for speaking up, but I'm only doing it for all of you, and that's my only concern. And I take a lot of flack from certain people. But let me say this. I'm just wondering, what is the process if these scrubbers or whatever you're putting in there don't work? It says it goes up through the ceiling and into the atmosphere. There's people living around there. Are you monitoring anything? Is it monitored?
Again, what Dave said was after it goes through the air stripper, there were carbon filters there.
Well, that's like in a household type filter, and exhaust to it over, you have a carbon filter there.
Right.
How
In other
often
words,
will those filters be changed, and who's monitoring those? And there's a lot of questions that have to be answered here. I'm going to read what I've taken in tonight. I can't get involved in everything tonight. There'll be questions that I'll be bringing up, and I'm sure other people. But another question I wanted to ask you,
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Go ahead.
Alan, could you, or Dave, tell him, Dick, where he might find this in the feasibility study or the proposed plan? He wants to hear the nuts and bolts, I think, of what an air stripper is and UV ozonation.
Sure. In chapters 4 and 5 is where we get into the technology screening. You'll find most of the descriptive detail on 3 processes that were retained. The carbon absorption, air stripping, and
Ultraviolet
treatment and UV oxidation. In chapter 5, you'll find detailed descriptions of them there. There are also a lot of references that you find in the reference section. For some reason, you'd like to see one of the references. Call David. It's things that we have on file that are they're not in the administrative record because typically these are technical references for a document. We can provide them today.
Is this the same process they use when you have trichloroethylene in the water and you try to get it out with the wiffle balls, or is this another? Is that another one I'm talking about?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's another. This isn't this one. The one I'm talking about, the wiffle balls to remove the trichloroethylene, that's another type process, right? Or is this part of that same process? Okay. We had problems with trichloroethylene. We had problems with a well in town here. They're going to put a stripper in that they use in Florida or Arizona or some places, and they have these wiffle balls that are being blown up in the air, and it's supposed to dispense of the trichloroethylene. But that only goes into the atmosphere, too. Is this going to go into the atmosphere, too?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is the packing that's actually inside the stripper. What they do is they put a packing, and a lot of times it is a type of plastic. And when the air is coming up and the water is coming down, when it hits the plastic, it breaks the water up and tends to atomize it, and that helps it volatilize. So that is the technology.
That's basically on this one here that we're using. So we have to make sure that all these filters and strippers and everything is functioning properly.
Right.
Okay. Now, what is going to collect all of this, the contaminants that are in it, the solids or whatever is coming up through that water? Do you have a process of collecting in a tank?
Yeah, it's a stepwise process. You want me to run through the graphic? Would that be helpful if I ran through the graphic again for you?
Well, if the other people are interested in it.
Let me just try to run through it in a little bit more detail than I went through before. What happens is you extract the groundwater out. When the groundwater comes out, it has the inorganic contaminants such as the metals and It also has the trichloroethylenes, the anilines, 1,4-dichlorobenzenes, a wide variety of semi-volatiles and volatiles that Sarah mentioned. So as I discussed, you need a treatment system that has got many different components to deal with those different contaminants. The first step is a precipitation step. There's metals that are dissolved. We need to get those out. If you don't get those out before the organic treatment, such as air stripping, they'll foul the unit. So the first step is to remove the metals. And to remove the dissolved metals, get it right here, we'll add a flocculant and we'll precipitate them out. In other words, they'll change to a solid format. And in this section of the chamber, they would settle out. The ones that were not removed through sedimentation would be further removed through a sand filter. So now we've pulled the metals out of the treatment stream, and all we have left are the organics. And as we talked about, we had the 3 treatment technologies for the organics: the air stripping, biological, and the UV oxidation. Here on the air stripping is exactly what you see. Here are the wiffle balls, the packing. The water is coming down, the air is coming up, and the contaminants are transferred from the water to the air. So you're right, we do have to clean the air, and that's a critical component. And to do that, we've got the carbon filters on the top. Now, Dave showed you a picture of a site in Maine. What you saw were not on top of it as they are in the schematic here, but those large canisters had carbon in, and the organic contaminants are removed in the gaseous state with the carbon. And in any remediation such as that, there would be an extensive stack monitoring program that would be monitoring 4 VOCs on a continuous basis. After that, what we have here, some of the low levels that are required for drinking water standards are required for protection of ecological based on ambient water quality criteria are very, very low. And the economics of them, of the whole process, to get it to the levels with air stripping, the most cost-effective way to do it is to put a polishing unit on the end as opposed to removing all of the contaminants with air stripping. So as I've indicated, it's a multi-component treatment system that would be required primarily because of the high levels that we have at Nyanza, the low levels you need to get to, and the wide variety of contaminants that we have out there.
I understand, sir. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yes, sir.
Joel Silverstein. Based on the description you gave on the process talking about the responsible parties and then going to the Superfund, when would this process begin, all things being considered? I mean, when would construction on this type of facility start?
Okay, well, before we get to construction, again, first, we're here tonight with a proposed plan. We're going to have our public hearing in approximately a month. And then Mr. Lederer will be writing a record of decision, or a RAD, for our regional administrator to sign. This is the person we work for at EPA in Boston. And that will be our final decision on what this remedy is. Again, tonight, all we're giving you is a proposal. Hopefully, we will sign this record of decision by the end of our fiscal year, which is September 30th, unless for some reason we have to change our mind as a result of comments received, in which case we could have to come out and do this again if we were to, have a new proposal. But anyway, probably, in the October time frame, we would be signing this record of decision. Essentially, within the next probably 6 months, these negotiations would take place with these, and I, again, stress the word potentially responsible parties. It's hard to predict how long basically those negotiations take. Some of them end very quickly. Again, if we don't receive any good faith offer, meaning any willingness by the parties to finance this remedy, we would terminate the negotiations fairly quickly, and then essentially would basically get in line with the other projects in the country for funding. If the negotiations are successful, past experience is that from the date we sign a ROD, a record of decision, until we sign a consent decree is generally a year to a year and a half. Essentially, it's a fairly long negotiation process, at the end of which we essentially refer a consent decree to the Department of Justice. They then have another public comment period. Again, any settlement that would be reached with the responsible parties or potentially responsible parties would also be put out for public comment. And it's another requirement in the statute. We don't settle with people without letting the public know on what terms we're settling, and they do have an opportunity to comment or critique those. So again, it's past experience is that you can probably figure on at least a year, I would say, after the record of decision is signed before we would have a final consent decree, or alternatively make a decision that negotiations were not going to be productive, and again, we would then try to get in line nationally. Essentially, the situation with the Superfund is it's hopefully I'm not boring anyone with this description. It's set up to be a revolving fund, meaning that it's generated by a tax on raw chemical producers, and the tax builds up in a trust fund. EPA spends the money, and then we hopefully recover funds from responsible parties, either in settlements or in litigation, and the money gets put back into the fund. Litigation being what it is, the money usually goes out faster than it comes back in. So the current situation, as I said, is the Congress has extended the taxing authority for another 4 years. And so we anticipate that the money will continue to be collected by this tax on chemical producers. We do have to, again, get in a queue with other projects nationally, but I don't really anticipate any problem there. As far as how long construction takes, as Dave mentioned, there are a number of pre-designed studies that need to be done, including aquifer testing and additional pilot testing. Again, past experiences, design on something like this is probably going to be a 1.5 to 2 year process. So it would seem to me, if I had a guess tonight, that construction on a treatment plant here would be at least 2 to 3 years off, if things go smoothly. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Claire Harper, Leech Lane. The liner, are they putting a liner in under the capping?
As a matter of fact, we have Ira Nadelman here from the Corps. Ira, would you like to give a 5-minute update on where we stand? Not to
Well,
put you on this.
I've been involved coming to a lot of the NIANs and meetings from the beginning. First they were going to put the liner, then they weren't going to put the liner. I understand the EPA now insists there should be liners. Am I right or wrong on that?
I'm not sure if I understand your term. We've put on a, quote, liner on top. We did not exhume all the waste and put one beneath the waste. So we have not done that and have no intention to do that here.
You're not going to do it at all?
Correct.
But I understand that's part of the law right now.
That's not really true. If you were to build a new hazardous waste landfill at this point in time, you would be required to put a liner beneath the waste. That is true. Essentially, the law that regulates how to describe this, an old hazardous waste landfill, is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also called RCRA, and essentially they call for what they call closure of old landfills or surface impoundments. Generally speaking, those involve putting a cap over the landfill, the purpose of which is to keep rainfall and other precipitation from infiltrating the waste, and in so doing, hopefully minimizing any leachate that comes out of the landfill. Right. As Dave, I think, mentioned in the description, as part of the phase 1 remedy, we're putting a cap on top of the waste, upgrading on the uphill side of the hill, so-called, we have a diversion trench, the function of which is to take runoff from a Gunko Hill and shallow groundwater and essentially divert it around the waste buried on the hill and hopefully keep them out of contact. On the downgrading side of the hill, or the downhill side, what this present phase 1 calls for is a monitoring system, meaning we're going to be installing monitoring wells below the base of the cap, essentially to find out how successful this cap is in keeping waste from migrating off the hill. As part of the second operable unit that Dave described tonight, we have costed out an option of essentially putting a trench at the base of the hill landfill to collect leachate if we find that there is still leachate emanating from the hill even after we've done the capping. Part of our problem here is a timing problem. Until the cap is actually fully installed and operating, and we have some monitoring data for some period of time, we're not going to be able to figure out how successful or fully successful it is in keeping the wastes where they lie on the hill. So what, as Dave indicated...
We do have, the rock is crushed there. It's broken in that area. Where they were gonna put the drain off, wasn't that all crushed, broken?
So the upper layers of fraction.
Yes. But now they're not gonna even put the trench.
No. Trench. I guess the point Rich is trying to make is that after the cap is fully functional, when we have it completely installed, which should be in about probably the end of this calendar year, we're going to be monitoring how the levels of groundwater contamination coming from the hill area change, if they do at all. We anticipate they will get substantially better. If they don't, we have in our plan that we're talking about tonight, a plan for this, what you see this dashed line here, which would be a collection trench, which would collect groundwater that has escaped from the cap. That is, it would take care of that, any groundwater that was contaminated that escaped from the cap. We don't, right now, we're hoping that that isn't necessary. It'll be extremely costly and difficult to build. But it is in our plan as an option, and we're going to be looking at that over the next couple of years.
Well, I understood from the beginning that the reason for the trench around the capping was so that the water, the overflow of the water will come down into that trench instead of through under the capping.
Correct. And it will.
But you're not going to put one?
No. At this point, the cap is essentially complete. But basically, given what was up on the hill, if you saw the first couple of slides I showed, I guess common misperception was that there was this discrete area of dumping, that there were 3 barrels here, 4 barrels there. That isn't really what was up there. I had the fortune or misfortune, or whatever anyone wants to call it, to spend a couple of days digging test trenches up on the hill with some of our contractors. And I can tell you, there's anything and everything up there, and it's just a mishmash of different contaminants in different states. And there really wasn't a viable option other than to construct the cap that we constructed. That was really the only way to go. Probably digging, again, this is rehashing things that were decided 5 and 6 years ago, but there's also was a certain threat to digging up all of that contamination that was already buried up there. There was definitely a hazard to that as well, which was also factored in. Okay. Anyone else have any questions?
Hi, I just wanted to ask you, if it's going to take approximately 2 years for something like this to go through, do they have any idea about how far this can expand? I mean, this is the area that you have now, but in 2 years from now, where is it going to go?
Well,
or do you have any idea?
The plume is moving depending on what area, the aquifer, the soil and the bedrock through which this contamination passes it's not uniform. It's got different layers, at least 4 layers that are talked about in our investigation reports. It moves at a rate towards the river, I want to stress, of about in the slower strata, it moves at a rate under a foot a year. In some of the faster strata, it could move on the order of 10 to 20 or 30 feet per year. Again, it's obviously much slower than surface water. But basically, the way it probably is expanding in our thoughts is this area probably is not expanding at all. And the area that we would be watching for expansion would be in this area here. But because the flow in that area is perpendicular to the river, to hydraulics of how groundwater flows, probably the major direction of flow is straight towards the river. So it would just continue to flow into the river. This line may expand slightly, but we don't feel it will expand rapidly. But again, we'll be doing monitoring over that period to see if there's any radical change.
Put a scale on how long that plume is?
That's approximately 2,300 feet from one end to the other. So we're not expecting a large expansion percentage-wise. Again, remember, this didn't start yesterday. This started during probably in the middle of World War I, so it's been a long time.
There's one other question before you call a meeting. I don't know if you plan to, but I wanted to find out, you said you're going to inspect or dig up those pipes on McGunkle Road. Could you give me an approximation when that may be achieved or when you may start it?
Well, it's part of the plan. I would expect we're going to have our negotiation phase. I would expect it would be during our pre-design phase, which it could be within a year or two. But I would say it'd be sooner than 3 years for certain. But again, a lot of it depends on how this negotiation process goes, as far as how quickly things occur. Did you want to give like 30 seconds for a minute
My best
on
30?
how the tapping is going?
It's going very well. I did less than 30.
Because everyone's very hot, but we probably should